A forgotten warship cries for help. A human mechanic removes its parasites and unleashes its true power. Even as a child, he had wandered among the rusting hulls of abandoned ships, his small hands tracing the cold metal as if trying to understand the secrets they held. The smell of salt, oil, and damp wood was comforting to him, a strange mixture that made him feel alive in a world that often felt empty. Now, in his late 30s, Elias had become one of the few mechanics who truly understood these forgotten giants. Others saw them as useless old machines that would never sail again. But Elias saw them differently. He saw stories, courage, and silent strength hiding beneath layers of rust and neglect. The dockyard was silent that morning, except for the distant cries of gulls and the occasional clatter of a loose plank in the wind. Sunlight reflected off patches of peeling paint on the enormous ships, casting broken patterns on the water below. Most of the ships had long ago been abandoned after the war, left to the mercy of time and the sea. Yet, amid all this decay, one ship stood out. It was massive, far larger than any other in the dockyard, and even from a distance, its outline suggested a presence that refused to be forgotten. This was the Sentinel, a warship once celebrated for its speed and power, now nearly swallowed by rust and creeping sea life. Elias approached the gangway carefully, his boots echoing on the wooden planks. He paused to look up at the towering metal walls, noticing the twisted cables and corroded railings that had once been polished to a shine. The ship groaned slightly under its own weight, as if warning him of the challenges ahead. But Elias did not hesitate. He carried with him a small toolkit, a notebook filled with diagrams, and a determination that was rare even among the most experienced mechanics. To him, this was more than just maintenance. It was a mission, a chance to restore something that had been ignored for far too long. Climbing aboard, he stepped into the shadowed corridor that led to the engine room. The air inside smelled of salt, mildew, and long-forgotten oil. Dust motes floated in the beams of light that pierced the cracked windows. Every surface bore the marks of time. Chipped paint, scratches, and deep grooves carved into the metal by tools that had long since disappeared. Elias ran his fingers along the edge of a control panel, feeling the rough texture of rust and the faint vibration of metal that had once been alive with energy. He took a deep breath, knowing that the task ahead would not be easy. Elias began by examining the ship's outer hull. Large patches of barnacles clung to the sides, their hard shells grinding against the metal and adding weight that the structure no longer seemed able to support. Seaweed had wrapped itself around cables and pipes, strangling them slowly but surely. Here and there, he could see the marks of corrosion, small holes eating into the thick steel like tiny, persistent teeth. It was clear that the Sentinel had been left to fight the elements alone for far too long. Yet, despite the damage, the ship still had an aura of strength. Its bow pointed proudly toward the horizon, as if ready to charge into the sea again at any moment. Elias smiled faintly. He liked to think that the ship recognized him, that it had been waiting for someone who could help it remember its true power. Moving closer to the engine room entrance, Elias noticed the intricate network of pipes, valves, and panels. He knelt down to inspect them, wiping away layers of grime and corrosion. His trained eyes quickly identified the worst problems: valves that were frozen shut, pipes weakened by rust, and electrical connections eaten away by moisture. The engine itself was silent, a massive beast trapped in time, its pistons stiff and unresponsive. Elias could almost hear the echoes of its past life, the roar of power that had once filled the air and commanded respect. He knew that restoring it would take more than just skill. It would take patience, determination, and a deep understanding of how the ship had been built and maintained decades ago. As he worked, Elias thought about the people who had served on the Sentinel. Sailors who had relied on its speed and strength, officers who had made critical decisions aboard its deck, and engineers who had poured their knowledge and sweat into keeping it functional. All of them were long gone, but their legacy remained in the ship's bones. Elias felt a connection to them, a sense of responsibility to honor their work. He made notes in his notebook, drawing sketches of damaged components and planning his repairs carefully. Every detail mattered. A single mistake could prevent the ship from ever moving again. Hours passed, and the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Elias moved through the corridors and compartments of the ship, removing small obstacles and making temporary repairs. He cleared barnacles from key points, lubricated moving parts, and tested the integrity of the hull in several locations. Each small success brought a sense of satisfaction, a reminder that even the most neglected machines could respond when treated with care. Yet he knew that the real challenge was still ahead. The ship's parasites, the rust, corrosion, and biological growths, were just the surface. The deeper problems lay hidden in the engine and control systems, waiting to reveal themselves at the most critical moment. Elias paused for a moment, leaning against a railing and looking out over the dockyard. The other ships, silent and abandoned, seemed to watch him as he worked. The wind carried the distant sounds of the city, but here on the dock, it felt like a world apart, a place frozen in time. He thought about how easy it would have been to give up, to let the Sentinel rot like the others. But something inside him refused to do that. There was a dignity in restoration, a beauty in bringing life back to something that had been forgotten. Elias felt a spark of excitement, a quiet anticipation of the moment when the ship might awaken once more. As the day wore on, he discovered more of the ship's secrets. Hidden compartments contained tools left behind by previous engineers, and panels revealed wiring that had been replaced haphazardly over the years. Each discovery was a puzzle piece, showing him how the ship had been cared for and neglected over decades. Elias worked methodically, removing obstacles and making careful repairs. The work was tiring, but it was also exhilarating. He felt as if he were having a conversation with the ship, learning its moods and understanding its needs. Each squeak of a hinge, each shudder of a loosened panel was a response, a sign that the ship recognized his efforts. By late afternoon, Elias had made significant progress. The exterior was cleared of the worst barnacles, moving parts were freed from rust, and initial inspections of the engine suggested that revival was possible. He wiped his brow, noticing streaks of oil and sweat on his face, and allowed himself a small smile. For the first time in decades, the Sentinel seemed less like a forgotten relic and more like a living, breathing entity, capable of fulfilling the purpose it had been built for. Elias knew that the hardest work was still ahead, but he felt a quiet confidence. He had always believed in second chances, in the power of care and persistence, and now that belief was being tested in the form of a massive, silent warship. As night fell, Elias lit a small lamp and continued his work inside the dim engine room. Shadows danced along the walls as he moved, and the air grew cooler, carrying the scent of the sea. Despite the silence, there was a sense of anticipation, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. Elias thought of the days ahead, of the long nights of cleaning, repairing, and replacing parts, and felt a deep sense of purpose. This was more than a mechanical task. It was a mission to restore dignity, to breathe life into something that had been abandoned and forgotten. And somehow he knew that when the ship finally stirred, the world would take notice. By the time Elias finally stepped outside for a break, the moon was high in the sky, casting silver light over the dockyard. He leaned against the railing of the gangway, looking up at the towering hull of the Sentinel. Despite the rust, the damage, and the years of neglect, the ship still carried itself with pride. Elias felt a mixture of awe and determination. Tomorrow, he would return with more tools, more plans, and renewed energy. The journey of restoring the Sentinel had only just begun, but he already felt that it would be worth every effort. The ship was not just metal and machinery. It was a symbol of resilience, strength, and the hope that even the most forgotten things could rise again with care and dedication. As Elias walked back to his small workshop nearby, he couldn't help but glance back one last time. In the moonlight, the massive warship seemed almost alive, its dark silhouette standing tall against the night sky. It was waiting, patient and silent, for the moment when its true power would be unleashed once more. And Elias, weary but resolute, felt ready to meet that challenge. The next morning, Elias returned to the Sentinel before sunrise. The dockyard was quiet, still shrouded in mist, and the air carried the salty scent of the sea. The enormous warship seemed to wait for him, its massive hull rising like a sleeping giant from the water. Elias could feel a thrill in his chest. Yesterday had been about observation and preparation, but today, the real work would begin. He tightened his tool belt, checked the spare parts in his bag, and climbed aboard, his boots echoing on the metal deck. He began with the ship's outer surfaces, carefully inspecting the hull and deck for signs of damage he might have missed before. At first glance, it looked like simple wear and tear, but Elias knew better. This ship had endured decades of neglect and the constant pressure of the ocean. The barnacles and algae clung more stubbornly than yesterday, twisting around bolts and seams, some of them thick enough to look like small shields. Elias scraped and chipped at them, revealing the metal underneath. As he worked, he noticed tiny cracks and rusted sections he hadn't seen before. Each one told a story. A storm survived, a collision weathered, a life-saving maneuver performed decades ago. Elias felt a mixture of awe and responsibility. These were the marks of history, and he could not allow them to destroy the ship entirely. Moving to the engine room, Elias encountered his first real surprise. The main engine, already stiff and unresponsive, was entangled with thick clusters of marine growth and corrosion. The pistons were frozen in place, and the old fuel lines were blocked with sediment and rust. Electrical panels that should have been silent now had corroded wires sparking faintly. Elias knelt, studying the damage. This was worse than he had expected, but he also felt excitement. He loved solving problems, and this was the ultimate challenge. He carefully disconnected power, wore gloves to protect his hands, and began removing the thick growth strangling the engine's machinery. Hours passed like minutes. Elias moved methodically, scraping barnacles, brushing rust away, and cleaning the pipes with tools he had specially crafted for this kind of work. The engine groaned as he worked, like it was waking from a long sleep, small shivers of movement running through the machinery. He paused often to sketch diagrams and make notes in his notebook, recording which parts needed replacement and which could be saved. Each success, however small, brought a spark of hope. As he cleared the engine room, Elias discovered more hidden issues. Some valves were jammed so tightly that it took all his strength to loosen them. Old seals had crumbled into powder, and some of the pistons were warped. The corroded fuel lines threatened to rupture at any moment. He realized that this was more than simple maintenance. The ship was infested with what he called parasites, rust, decay, and invasive growths that had been eating away at it silently for decades. Each parasite had to be removed carefully, or it would destroy the ship entirely. Elias felt a deep respect for the ship. It was not just metal and machinery. It had survived storms, battles, and neglect, and now it was trusting him to bring it back to life. As he worked deeper into the ship, Elias noticed strange things in the control room. Panels that should have glowed with life were dim or dead. Some levers were stuck in mid-motion, and others had rusted so badly that even small movement caused them to shake violently. Dust and corrosion had collected in the tiniest crevices, hiding the ship's intricate design. Elias took a moment to breathe, staring at the panels. He imagined the sailors who had once worked here, how their hands had moved across these controls in the middle of storms, with lives depending on every action. That thought strengthened his resolve. He was not just repairing metal. He was restoring a vessel that had carried human lives through danger and uncertainty. By mid-morning, he faced one of the most dangerous challenges, the ship's main electrical grid. Water damage over the years had caused wires to corrode, creating small sparks that could start a fire if handled incorrectly. Elias carefully disconnected sections, cleaned contacts with special solutions, and replaced damaged wiring. Each step required focus and patience. He had to move slowly, checking and rechecking his work. A single mistake could damage the system beyond repair or even hurt him. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with the salt and grime of the ship, but he refused to stop. He knew the effort was worth it. While cleaning one section of the hull, Elias found a hole in the metal large enough for his hand to fit. He inspected it closely and discovered that corrosion had eaten through the ship's outer layer. This hole, though small, threatened the integrity of the entire compartment. He marked it in his notebook and planned a patch. It would not be simple. He would need to cut a new piece of metal, fit it precisely, and seal it to prevent water from entering. This was the kind of work that required skill, patience, and a steady hand. Elias felt a thrill at the challenge. It was as if the ship were daring him to prove that it could still survive. By afternoon, the ship had begun to respond to his efforts. Small mechanisms that had been frozen moved slightly when he applied careful pressure. Panels in the control room began to click and hum faintly, reacting to his cleaning of the electrical contacts. Even the hull seemed firmer under his hands, as if the removal of parasites had freed the ship to stand tall once again. Elias felt a surge of pride, mixed with something he could only describe as respect. This was not just a machine. It was a living monument to human skill, endurance, and courage, and it trusted him to guide it back to life. But the work was far from over. As he continued, he discovered hidden chambers full of rusted tools, old equipment, and broken machinery. Some compartments had been sealed for decades, and the air inside was thick with dust and salt. Elias moved carefully, mindful of weakened floors and hidden dangers. Every step he took was a balance between progress and caution. In one compartment, he found an old engine part that had been replaced incorrectly years ago. He replaced it with a proper piece he had brought, testing it carefully. When it fit perfectly, he felt a wave of satisfaction. The ship was beginning to trust him just as he trusted it. Late in the afternoon, Elias faced his most frightening challenge yet. The engine's central piston assembly, corroded and stuck, had to be freed. It was enormous and dangerous. If handled incorrectly, it could collapse and crush anything nearby. Elias took a deep breath, double-checked all connections, and began the careful process of loosening the assembly. Minutes felt like hours as he worked, sweat pouring down his face, muscles straining, mind entirely focused. With a final twist, the piston moved, groaning and rattling, but free. Elias stepped back, breathing heavily, and felt a wave of relief and triumph. The ship had responded. It was alive in its own slow, careful way, and it was ready to continue the fight against time and neglect. As evening approached, Elias lit lamps and continued his work. Shadows danced across the walls, and the ship seemed to whisper in the quiet, as if encouraging him to keep going. He cleaned more pipes, tested valves, and checked electrical circuits. Each success was a small victory, a sign that the ship's parasites were being removed and that its true strength was beginning to return. He moved with precision, aware that every small step mattered. One careless action could undo hours of work or damage a critical system. By the time he paused for a short break, the ship had transformed subtly but noticeably. Barnacles and algae had been removed from key areas, the engine room was less obstructed, and some panels in the control room were beginning to respond to his touch. The ship no longer seemed like a forgotten relic. It was a powerful, sleeping giant, waiting for someone who could bring it back to life. Elias leaned against a railing, feeling the cool night air on his face, and smiled faintly. He was exhausted, but the work had been rewarding. The ship had revealed itself to him, piece by piece, and he felt a connection that went beyond mechanics. He knew there were still more parasites to remove, more corrosion to fight, and more repairs to make. But for the first time, he truly believed that the Sentinel could be restored. The ship had survived storms, neglect, and time itself, and now it had him, someone willing to see its value, to care for it, and to bring it back to life. Elias felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. This was not just a task or a job. It was a mission, a chance to revive a symbol of courage and strength that had been forgotten for too long. As he prepared to leave for the night, Elias looked back at the massive hull. Moonlight reflected off the cleaned surfaces, highlighting the ship's contours. Despite the years of neglect, it seemed to shine faintly, as if proud of the progress made. Elias felt a sense of hope. Tomorrow he would continue, uncovering more parasites, restoring more systems, and bringing the Sentinel ever closer to its former glory. And somehow, he knew that the work they were doing together would not only save the ship, but awaken something powerful within it, a force that had been waiting for decades to be unleashed. The next morning, Elias arrived at the dockyard with renewed energy. The early sun glinted off the water, casting golden light on the towering form of the Sentinel. The ship had changed slightly since yesterday. Its hull looked cleaner, and the engine room, though far from complete, seemed less oppressive. Elias felt a surge of determination. Today, he would tackle the heart of the ship, the engine and control systems that had been trapped under decades of neglect and parasites. He stepped carefully onto the deck, his boots echoing in the quiet morning. The wind carried the scent of salt and oil, familiar and comforting. Elias set down his toolbox and began methodically removing the last stubborn barnacles clinging to the hull near the engine vents. With each scrape and brush, he could feel the metal underneath responding, freed from the grip of the sea. The ship seemed alive, almost grateful, as if recognizing the effort that was being poured into its revival. Elias smiled faintly. He often imagined the ship as a sleeping giant, slowly awakening under his care. Moving to the engine room, Elias faced a massive challenge. The main engine was enormous, its pistons and valves frozen and corroded. Rust covered every surface, and the thick marine growths had embedded themselves deep into the moving parts. Elias knelt carefully, examining the intricate mechanisms, noting which areas were too damaged to repair immediately and which could be restored. Every section of the engine had its own personality, and Elias treated it as such, moving slowly and carefully, respecting the metal and the years it had endured. He began by loosening the valves that controlled the flow of fuel and water. Some were stiff with rust, requiring both skill and strength to move. Others had corroded entirely, needing replacement. Elias improvised with parts he had salvaged from other old ships, carefully fitting them into place. Each small success was a victory. The engine groaned faintly as he worked, the sound like a warning and an encouragement all at once. Elias could almost imagine the engine remembering its past, the roar it had once produced, the power it had delivered in times of war. As he worked, Elias discovered another obstacle. A thick layer of sediment and salt had built up in the fuel lines, blocking the flow entirely. He carefully removed the lines, cleaning each one with precision, testing and retesting to ensure no obstruction remained. He took his time, aware that even a single mistake could damage the engine beyond repair. The work was exhausting, both physically and mentally, but Elias welcomed the challenge. There was a rhythm to it, a connection between man and machine that he had never experienced elsewhere. Hours passed, and the ship began to respond. Small movements in the pistons, a faint hum in the electrical circuits, and the subtle vibration of the hull under his hands were signs that progress had been made. Elias paused for a moment, listening. The engine groaned like a beast stretching after a long sleep. It was not fully awake, not yet, but it was alive, and that gave Elias hope. He made detailed notes, marking which sections required reinforcement, lubrication, or replacement. Every step brought the ship closer to the moment it would fully awaken. By afternoon, Elias faced another challenge. The control room, where navigation and communication systems were housed, was in worse condition than he had imagined. Corrosion had eaten through key panels, wires were frayed and sparking, and some instruments were completely destroyed. Elias approached with caution, carefully disconnecting damaged circuits before attempting repairs. He replaced old wires, cleaned contacts, and tested each system meticulously. Each time he succeeded, a panel flickered to life, a light glowed faintly, and the ship seemed to hum with recognition. While repairing the controls, Elias found a hidden compartment that had been sealed for decades. Inside were old logs, rusted tools, and components that had been forgotten long ago. He carefully documented each item, fascinated by the history contained in this small space. Some parts were useful, others were too damaged to save. Elias set aside the salvageable pieces, knowing they might be crucial for later stages of restoration. He felt a connection to the engineers who had worked on this ship decades ago, imagining their careful hands and meticulous work. It was as if their efforts were guiding him, even from the past. As evening approached, Elias faced perhaps the most dangerous part of the day, the central piston assembly of the engine. Years of rust and neglect had frozen it solid, and freeing it required precision and strength. He checked every connection, reinforced weak points, and carefully began the process of loosening the assembly. The pistons creaked and groaned, and for a moment, Elias feared they might collapse. But he remained focused, using his strength and skill to move each part with care. After tense moments of effort, the assembly shifted, freed at last. Elias leaned back, breathing heavily, a mix of relief and triumph washing over him. The heart of the ship was beginning to beat again. With the engine partially freed, Elias turned his attention to the smaller systems. Pumps, turbines, and auxiliary engines were all affected by rust and marine growths. He worked tirelessly, cleaning, repairing, and replacing components, often improvising with limited parts. The work required constant attention to detail. One misplaced bolt or misaligned gear could cause serious problems. Elias moved carefully, methodically, treating each system as if it were a living organism. Slowly, the ship's machinery began to respond to his efforts. Hums and clicks echoed through the compartments, signaling small victories that spurred him onward. During a short break, Elias climbed to the deck and looked out at the dockyard. The sun was setting, casting orange and pink hues across the water. The other abandoned ships looked dull and lifeless in comparison to the Sentinel, which seemed to radiate potential energy. Elias felt a sense of pride and connection. This ship, long forgotten, was beginning to remember itself, and he had a role in its revival. The work was far from finished, but the progress so far was encouraging. He allowed himself a small smile, knowing that persistence, patience, and care were beginning to pay off. Night fell, and Elias continued to work under the soft glow of his lamps. The engine room was filled with the scent of oil, metal, and salt, a mixture he found strangely comforting. Each component he repaired, each obstruction he removed, brought the ship closer to its former glory. He tested valves, cleaned panels, and inspected every pipe, making sure the systems were as free from parasites as possible. The ship responded to his touch, moving slightly, groaning faintly, as if acknowledging his effort. Elias felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He was not just fixing a machine, he was restoring history, memory, and strength. As midnight approached, Elias faced one last task for the day, inspecting the hull for weak points that could threaten the ship during operation. He climbed into the lower compartments, flashlight in hand, and carefully examined the steel plates. He found rusted areas that required immediate reinforcement, and he made detailed notes for repairs. Each hole, each crack, told a story of storms survived and battles fought. Elias felt humbled by the ship's resilience and determined to preserve its strength. By the time he finished, the ship had changed visibly. The engine groaned with tentative life, the control panels flickered with energy, and the hull felt more solid under his hands. The parasites, though not completely removed, were being weakened, and the ship was responding to the care he provided. Elias allowed himself a moment to rest, sitting on the deck and looking out over the calm water. The night was quiet except for the distant cries of gulls and the soft lapping of waves. He felt a profound connection to the ship, as if it were a living being, grateful for his dedication. Elias knew the hardest work was still ahead. Removing all the parasites, restoring the engine fully, and bringing the ship back to operational status would take time, skill, and unwavering patience. But he felt confident. The small victories so far had proven that the ship was capable of responding, of regaining its strength if guided carefully. Elias was determined to see the mission through, not for fame or reward, but for the satisfaction of restoring a forgotten giant to its true power. As he packed up his tools and prepared to leave for a short rest, Elias looked up at the towering form of the Sentinel. Moonlight reflected off the metal, highlighting areas he had cleaned and repaired. The ship seemed almost alive, standing proud despite years of neglect. Elias felt a quiet sense of hope and determination. Tomorrow, he would continue, digging deeper into the engine, removing more parasites, and preparing the ship for the moment it would roar back to life. He turned away reluctantly, knowing that the journey was far from over but confident that every effort brought them closer to revival. Walking back to his small workshop, Elias reflected on the day's work. He thought about the engineers and sailors who had once served on this ship, about the battles it had endured, and about the storms it had survived. He felt a sense of connection across time, as if the ship and its past crew were guiding him. The challenge was immense, but so was the reward. The Sentinel had already begun to awaken, and Elias knew that when it fully did, the result would be nothing short of extraordinary. As he drifted to sleep that night, Elias dreamed of the ship moving through the water, powerful and majestic, its engines humming and its deck alive with activity. He imagined the day when it would sail again, no longer forgotten, no longer silent, a testament to resilience, dedication, and the human touch. And deep inside, he knew that this dream was not impossible. The Sentinel was ready, and he was ready. Together, they would face the final challenges and unleash the true power that had been sleeping for decades. The morning air was crisp and cool when Elias returned to the dockyard. The sun was just rising, casting a pale gold light over the water. The Sentinel waited for him as it had every day, massive and silent, but now there was a subtle difference. The ship seemed less like a relic and more like a living giant, its hull gleaming faintly where barnacles had been scraped away and metal polished. Elias took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Today was different. Today, he would test the ship in ways he had only dreamed of until now. He stepped onto the deck, boots echoing against the metal, and looked over the vast structure. The work of the past days had transformed it. The engine room had been cleared of obstructions, the electrical systems repaired and tested, and most of the parasites, rust, corrosion, and marine growth had been removed. Yet there were still risks. A ship that had been abandoned for decades could be unpredictable, even dangerous. Elias carried his toolkit and a notebook full of notes and diagrams, checking and rechecking every connection, every valve, every system. Care, he reminded himself, was the key. Starting in the engine room, he performed final inspections. Each piston moved smoothly, lubricated and freed from years of rust. Valves opened and closed without resistance, and electrical systems hummed with energy. He ran small tests, applying minimal power, and observed the reactions carefully. The ship responded to him almost instantly, a quiet vibration running through the hull, like the heartbeat of a giant stirring. Elias felt a thrill of excitement. He had seen the ship awake in small ways before, but this was different. Today, the engine would truly come to life. He moved to the control room, checking instruments and communication panels. Lights flickered on one by one, indicators glowing softly. The controls felt solid and responsive beneath his hands. Elias smiled faintly, feeling a mix of pride and anticipation. For weeks, he had treated every problem, every obstruction, and every parasite with patience and care. Now the moment had come to see whether all that work would bear fruit. With a steady hand, he initiated the first full engine test. The engine roared, slowly at first, then louder as systems engaged. The vibration ran through the deck, subtle but powerful, and the air was filled with the scent of warmed metal and oil. Elias felt the energy of the ship under him, alive in a way he had never imagined. It was not perfect yet. The engine's roar was uneven, the hum of the machinery rough in places, but it was undeniably alive. He adjusted valves and checked systems as he had rehearsed in his mind, listening carefully, responding quickly. Each correction brought the engine closer to full power. As the hours passed, the Sentinel seemed to gain confidence, moving more smoothly, responding more quickly to Elia's commands. The vibrations of the engine were no longer harsh but steady, strong, and controlled. The ship had been silent for decades, but now it was finding its voice again. Elias paused for a moment, resting his hands on a railing, feeling the energy running through the metal beneath his fingers. He could almost imagine the past crew, sailors long gone, watching silently as the giant they had once trusted began to roar again. By midday, the engine was fully operational. Every piston, valve, and panel worked in harmony. Elias had tested each system multiple times, each success confirming that the parasites were gone, and the ship had regained its strength. The dockyard workers, who had long dismissed the Sentinel as a useless hulk, now watched in awe as the once-forgotten warship rumbled with life. Elias felt a quiet sense of triumph. This was more than mechanical success. It was proof that dedication, patience, and respect could revive even the most neglected giants. The next step was movement. Elias carefully coordinated the rudder, thrusters, and engines, preparing for the ship's first test in water after decades of silence. The dockyard was filled with tension and excitement. Everyone held their breath as he slowly guided the controls, the engines humming steadily, responding precisely to his commands. The ship's massive hull shifted slightly, then more decisively, water rushing along the sides as it moved. A cheer rose from the dockyard workers, though Elias remained focused. One wrong move, even now, could damage years of careful work. As the Sentinel glided gently into open water, Elias allowed himself a moment to observe. The ship moved with surprising grace, its power evident in the steady wake trailing behind. He tested various systems, engines at full power, thrusters and rudder responding perfectly. The parasites had been removed, and the ship's true strength was finally free. Elias felt a surge of satisfaction and connection. For weeks, he had poured every ounce of skill and determination into this restoration, and now he could see the result. A warship reborn, powerful, majestic, and alive. The afternoon passed with Elias running more tests, pushing the ship to limits it had not reached in decades. The hull vibrated with energy, the engines roared steadily, and the control panels responded instantly to the slightest touch. Every system that had been blocked, broken, or corroded now worked perfectly. Elias moved through the ship like a conductor guiding an orchestra, each adjustment precise and deliberate. He felt the bond between human and machine deepen. The Sentinel was no longer silent. It had a voice, a presence, a life that he could feel through every vibration beneath his hands. As evening fell, Elias allowed himself a moment of reflection. He stood on the deck, looking at the golden light reflecting off the water, and thought about the long journey that had brought him here. This ship had survived storms, battles, and decades of neglect. He had removed its parasites, restored its systems, and unleashed its true power. Yet the process had been more than mechanical, it had been emotional, a journey of respect, patience, and care. Elias understood now that the ship was more than metal and machinery. It was a living testament to history, courage, and resilience. That night, Elias made one final inspection before leaving the dockyard. The engine room hummed steadily, control panels glowed softly, and the hull was solid and free from major corrosion. The parasites were gone, and the ship seemed to rest confidently in the water, alive but patient, waiting for the next adventure. Elias cleaned his tools, checked his notes, and prepared for the coming days, when further tests and fine-tuning would ensure the ship's full readiness. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction and pride, knowing that his work had restored not just a machine, but a legacy. As he walked back to his small workshop nearby, Elias thought about the sailors who had once relied on the Sentinel, about the engineers who had maintained it, and about the battles it had faced. He felt connected to them, as if their spirit lived on in the ship and now in him. The warship, once abandoned and forgotten, had found a new life through human dedication. Elias understood the lesson clearly. Even the most neglected, forgotten things could regain their strength with care, respect, and persistence. In the days that followed, Elias continued testing the ship. Each trial revealed small issues that required adjustment, but none were serious. The ship had been freed from the parasites that had drained its strength, and it responded flawlessly to his commands. Dockyard workers, once skeptical, now watched with admiration as the giant moved gracefully through the water, its engines powerful, its deck solid, and its systems fully functional. Elias felt a sense of pride, but he remained humble. He knew that this revival was not just about skill. It was about patience, understanding, and dedication. One morning, as the sun rose over the calm sea, Elias took the ship on a longer journey beyond the dockyard. The water sparkled under the rising sun, and the wind filled the air as the Sentinel glided effortlessly. Every system worked in harmony. The engines roared with confidence, the rudder and thrusters responded perfectly, and the hull cut through the water with unmatched power. Elias felt a deep sense of accomplishment and connection. He had removed the parasites, repaired the machinery, and restored the ship's true power. Now it was free to move again, majestic and alive. He paused on the deck, looking out at the horizon. The journey had been long and difficult, but the reward was greater than he could have imagined. The Sentinel was no longer a forgotten relic. It was a symbol of resilience, strength, and the power of human care. Elias felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that he had played a part in restoring something extraordinary. The ship, once silent, now roared confidently across the water, a living testament to what could be achieved when patience, skill, and dedication met opportunity. By the end of the week, the Sentinel was fully operational. Every system from engines to control panels was functional. The ship could sail confidently, its parasites gone, its power unleashed, and its legacy restored. Dockyard workers, visitors, and even nearby sailors came to marvel at the transformation. Elias stood quietly on the deck, watching the ship move smoothly through the water. He felt a profound connection to this warship, to the history it carried, and to the lives it had once touched. The journey of restoration had ended, but the story of the Sentinel was only beginning. Elias understood that care and respect could revive even the most forgotten giants. He had removed the parasites, restored the systems, and unleashed the ship's true power. But more importantly, he had reminded himself and others that dedication, patience, and love could bring life back to things that were neglected and abandoned. The Sentinel would sail again, powerful, majestic, and alive, a symbol of human determination and the enduring spirit of those who refuse to give up.